A poor woman asked a stranger for a ride to save her sick daughter. She said, "Please help me, I need to take her to the hospital." But she had no idea the man was a millionaire CEO who would change her life. The heat was stifling that afternoon. Lucia wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked again at Emily. The girl was burning up with fever in the makeshift bed of their tiny apartment on the 5th floor of a building with no elevator. "Mommy, it hurts," Emily murmured, her eyes half closed. She was only 8 years old, but the pain made her seem even smaller, curled up against the damp pillow. Lucia placed her hand on her daughter's forehead. Her skin was hotter than before. The digital thermometer flashed red, 104.3 degrees Celsius. The last 2 nights had been spent keeping vigil, using home remedies, and whispering prayers. Nothing worked. "Hang in there, my love," Lucia said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We'll look for help." The cell phone in her hand showed 0 balance, no credit to call 911. Public transportation in the neighborhood was unreliable, and taxis rarely accepted trips to the Fairview district, known for its violence and poverty. The empty kitchen cabinets revealed that the end of the month had come far too quickly. It had been a few months since she lost her job at a department store, and her cleaning gigs barely covered the rent for the small 1-bedroom apartment. Lucia soaked a towel in cold water and placed it on Emily's forehead. The child trembled, sweat streaming down her pale face. Little red spots began appearing on her thin arms, something that hadn't been there a few hours ago. Fear grew like a cold wave rising in her stomach. Through the broken window, covered by a piece of cardboard, the afternoon sky was starting to change color. Night would come soon. The thought of Emily spending another night in that condition was unbearable. "Come on, sweetie. Just hold on a little longer." Lucia found her last $10 hidden in a drawer for emergencies. It wouldn't be enough for a taxi, but maybe for a bus. She checked her watch. The next one would come in 40 minutes, too long to wait. She carefully lifted Emily into her arms. The girl felt so light, as if she had lost weight in just a few days. Her frail body was burning like an ember against her mother's chest. Emily's only clean outfit, a faded blue dress, now clung to her feverish body. Lucia descended 5 flights of stairs, balancing her daughter in her arms. They passed through the dimly lit hallway, where the smell of mold mixed with the scent of someone's cooking. Loud music blared from one of the apartments. Nobody asked if they needed help. In Fairview, everyone minded their own problems. The afternoon sun beat down on the cracked asphalt as they left the building. The nearest hospital was on the other side of the city, almost 4 miles away. Impossible to walk that distance with Emily in this state. Lucia decided to head toward the main avenue, where she might find a ride. The neighborhood streets were nearly empty at that hour. A few teenagers stood on the corner, watching with suspicion. An elderly woman swept the sidewalk in front of a small grocery store. Lucia walked past them in hurried steps, not asking for help. She knew nobody there had a car or money to spare. When she reached the main avenue, traffic was steady. Cars sped by, leaving only the rush of air and fine dust that clung to her sweaty skin. Lucia raised her free hand several times. No one stopped. "Please," she murmured to each vehicle that passed. "Please." Her legs already ached from Emily's weight and her brisk pace. The girl was breathing with difficulty in her arms, uttering incoherent words. The fever made her delirious. A truck went by so close it almost brushed them. The driver didn't even slow down. A packed bus drove past the improvised stop where Lucia waited. It wasn't an official bus stop. "We're almost there, my love," Lucia lied, swallowing the lump in her throat. The sun was starting to set, and soon it would be dark. The thought of being out there in the dark with Emily in that condition made her heart skip a beat. She tried once more. A grey car sped by. A family in a minivan glanced for a second and then accelerated. 2 teenagers on noisy motorcycles passed by, laughing loudly, oblivious to the desperation on her face. A faint sound escaped Emily's throat. "Mommy, I'm cold." It wasn't cold. The afternoon still held the day's heat, and it was the fever causing the chills. Lucia adjusted the child's body in her arms and kept trying, now even more desperate. That was when Emily started trembling harder. A violent spasm shook her small body, and for an instant her eyes rolled back. Lucia froze on the sidewalk, panic taking over. "Emily, Emily, look at me!" The girl didn't respond. Her body felt hotter than ever, and her breathing came in quick, shallow gasps. The red spots were now spreading across her neck and face. Lucia felt her legs buckle. She fell to her knees on the dusty sidewalk, still holding Emily against her chest. The first sob escaped her, then another. Tears blurred her vision as she desperately tried to bring her daughter back to consciousness. "Someone, please, anyone." Cars continued passing by. Some drivers looked curious, but no one stopped. A man on the opposite side of the street watched for a moment, then looked away and continued on. A woman carrying shopping bags quickened her pace, as if desperation were contagious. In that moment, kneeling on the sidewalk with her feverish daughter, Lucia felt the deepest loneliness of her life. A black sedan appeared on the avenue, slowing down as it approached the intersection. This time, Lucia didn't bother to lift her hand. Her strength was failing with each sob, each tremor that shook Emily. The car passed them slowly, and for an instant, Lucia thought it would be just another vehicle ignoring them. But then she heard the brakes, and through tear-blurred eyes, she saw the reverse lights come on. The black sedan stopped a few yards ahead. The driver's door opened. A man got out. Tall, with slightly graying hair at the temples, wearing simple but good quality clothes. He looked about 40, his face marked not so much by age as by something deeper. A thin scar cut across his right eyebrow, and his dark eyes held a calmness that seemed forced, like a well-adjusted mask. "Do you need help?" he asked, walking toward them with decisive steps. His voice was low and husky, like someone who doesn't speak much. His gaze quickly assessed the situation. The woman on her knees, the feverish child, the evident despair. "My daughter," Lucia could barely speak through her sobs. "She's burning up with fever. I need to get her to the hospital, but I have no way." The man moved closer without hesitation. He knelt beside them and briefly touched Emily's forehead. His face tensed for a moment as he felt the child's heat. "Let's go. My car is right there." Without another word, he helped Lucia to her feet and guided her to the sedan. He opened the back door and helped seat Emily. The girl barely stirred during the transfer. "Stay with her in the back. Hold her so she doesn't slip around when I drive." Lucia climbed in and pulled Emily onto her lap. The man closed the door, got behind the wheel, and started the car. The air conditioning blew a cool breeze, offering slight relief. "County Hospital or St. Clara?" he asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Whichever's closest," Lucia replied. "But I can't afford a private one." "County Hospital, then." The car pulled away smoothly. The interior was clean and organized, but not luxurious. A small basketball keychain dangled from the dashboard. There were no photos or personal items in sight, only a book on the passenger seat with a bookmark halfway through. Silence filled the vehicle. It was a heavy silence, almost tangible. Lucia kept her eyes on Emily, gently stroking her sweat-soaked hair. The girl babbled incoherent words, lost in fever. "How did she get like this?" The man's voice broke the silence after a few minutes. "It started as a cold 3 days ago," Lucia explained, never taking her eyes off her daughter. "Yesterday the fever hit. I gave her medicine but it didn't go down. And now these spots." The man nodded, looking back at the road. His fingers gripped the steering wheel more tightly for an instant. "What's her name?" "Emily. She's 8. A muscle in the man's jaw twitched. He swallowed hard before speaking again. "And yours?" "Lucia." He didn't offer his name right away. He just kept driving, focused on the road, maintaining a speed that was fast enough for an emergency but still safe. "David," he finally said, after a long silence. Lucia nodded, observing him in the mirror. There was something about him, a controlled stiffness, like someone holding himself together by sheer will. His eyes in the mirror seemed to look beyond the road, carrying an invisible weight. "Thank you for stopping, David," she said, her voice steadier now. "Many people passed by without stopping." "People are afraid to get involved," he answered, emotionless. "Afraid of what it might cost them." He didn't elaborate, and Lucia didn't ask. The way he said it didn't sound like a judgment of the other drivers. It sounded like a personal observation, something he had learned the hard way. Emily coughed and writhed in her mother's arms. Lucia adjusted the sweaty dress, worried by the increasingly frequent tremors. "How long to the hospital?" "About 20 minutes, David said, accelerating a bit more. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky orange and red. Through the window, Lucia saw they were leaving the Fairview district. The houses looked better maintained, the streets had fewer potholes, and the sidewalks were wider. The inequality was evident in the changing scenery. "Where do you two live?" David asked, breaking the silence again. "On the east side," Lucia answered briefly. "Fairview district." David just nodded. The neighborhood's name was enough. Everyone knew Fairview was the poorest part of the city, with decaying buildings, poorly lit streets, and no attention from the local government. Lucia focused again on Emily, adjusting the thin dress over her daughter's shoulders. Silence returned. It wasn't comfortable, but at that moment, it was better than unnecessary questions. Through the window, middle-class suburbs began to appear. The contrast was striking. Where Lucia came from, buildings had cracks, sidewalks were broken, and playgrounds were just rusted frames. The landscape continued to change as they neared the center of town. Commercial buildings, then department stores, and finally the medical district. The city lights were coming on as the sky grew dark. Lucia remained silent. There was no room for trivial conversation, while Emily burned with fever in her arms. She looked at the clock on the car's dashboard. Every minute felt like an eternity. Emily whimpered and opened her eyes for a moment. "Mommy, where are we?" "We're going to the doctor, my love." Lucia kissed her scorching forehead. "Just hang on a little longer." "It hurts," Emily whispered, closing her eyes again. David glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, Lucia saw something on his face. A flicker of old pain that flashed through his eyes as he looked at Emily. It was quick, like a spark, but unmistakable. He pressed the accelerator harder, his eyes now fully focused on the road. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the only visible sign of any reaction. Silence continued. Only the soft hum of the engine and Emily's labored breathing filled the space. David seemed lost in his thoughts, as if the sight of a sick child had opened a door to memories he preferred to keep shut. The city was now fully illuminated by streetlights and signs. Traffic grew heavier as they approached the downtown area. David maneuvered deftly, finding gaps between cars, keeping his speed whenever possible. Emily's breathing grew more strained. Lucia held her closer, as though trying to shield her from whatever was happening inside her little body. Fear was now a physical presence, tightening Lucia's throat and making it hard for her to breathe. "We're almost there," David said as the first signs for the hospital came into view. Lucia felt a momentary relief, immediately replaced by the fear of what they would face at the hospital. No insurance, little money, and a child in serious condition. The scenario so many mothers in Fairview dreaded. David was now driving with silent intensity, as if getting to the hospital as fast as possible was personal. At one intersection, the light turned red, but he only slowed enough to check for oncoming cars before running it. Emily shuddered in Lucia's arms. The red spots now covered almost her entire face and neck, stark against the frightening pallor of her skin. "David," Lucia whispered, her voice trembling. It was the first time she used his name. "I think she's getting worse." He didn't respond, but the car picked up speed. His eyes met Lucia's in the rearview mirror for an instant, a fierce determination there, almost primal. Something she recognized instantly as the instinct to protect a child at all costs. As the city lay behind them, the lights began to dim. Now they were on the road leading to the county hospital. Two headlights lit the dark path ahead, the sedan's speed unwavering and resolute. Emily was deteriorating fast, her tremors intensified, and her breathing grew more shallow by the minute. The red spots now covered almost her entire face, traveling down her neck to her chest. "Hang in there, my love," Lucia whispered, pushing aside the damp hair clinging to Emily's forehead. "We're almost there." It had always been just the two of them. Ever since Emily was born, Lucia had faced the world alone. Every fever, every bruise, every sleepless night, they always fought together, but this time was different. The fever wouldn't break, the spots were spreading, and Emily, usually so strong, seemed to fade with every passing minute. She glanced at the dashboard clock. How much longer? Seconds felt like hours as she held her feverish daughter. "Mommy!" Emily's voice was barely audible. "I'm here, baby." Lucia leaned over her, heart in her throat. "I'm right here. I'm scared." That fragile whisper cut through Lucia like a knife. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. "You don't have to be scared. I won't let anything happen to you." But the truth was, Lucia was terrified too. Her deep, visceral fear that grew with each spasm racking Emily's small body. What if they were too late? What if she couldn't do anything? The car sped along the dark highway, the engine the only sound slicing through the night. In the front seat, David remained silent, eyes fixed on the road. He offered no comforting words or questions. He just drove as though he knew every second mattered. Emily closed her eyes again, her breathing even more labored. Lucia felt a sob rise in her throat but forced it down. She had to be strong. She couldn't break. Not now. In the distance, the hospital lights began to appear. A complex of buildings standing out in the night like a beacon of hope. So close, yet it felt so far. Lucia held Emily a bit tighter. The girl had always been small for her age, but now she seemed even smaller, consumed by fever. 8 years old. Only 8. A whole life ahead. "Look, honey," Lucia pointed out the window, trying to keep her voice steady. "You can see the hospital. We're almost there." Emily didn't respond. Her eyes stayed closed, her chest moving up and down in quick, shallow breaths. The red spots stood out even more against her pale skin. The sedan turned onto the road leading straight to County Hospital. The complex now dominated the view ahead. The emergency lights flashed red and blue, urgent beacons in the darkness. For a moment, Emily's face relaxed. A soft sigh escaped her lips, and Lucia felt her daughter's body go limp in her arms. "Emily?" Lucia's voice pitched higher with panic. "Emily, talk to me." The girl didn't respond. She was completely limp, her head lolling to one side. "Faster!" Lucia shouted, unable to contain her desperation. "Please, faster!" David didn't reply, but the car surged forward instantly. The engine roared as they sped down the highway, headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Lucia gently shook Emily, then more firmly. "Wake up, baby. Please, wake up." Nothing. Only the faint movement of her breathing, so weak now that Lucia had to place her hand in front of Emily's nose to be sure she was still alive. The hospital lights drew nearer. David steered the car with precision, ignoring speed limits and signs. The parking lot came into view, partially filled with cars and ambulances. "Just a little more," Lucia whispered, tears finally escaping. They fell onto Emily's face as she leaned in to kiss her forehead. "Just hold on, my love." The county hospital stood before them, its emergency doors brightly lit. People came and went, doctors and nurses visible through the glass doors. Salvation was just a few yards away, if only Emily could hold on a bit longer. The black sedan pulled up to the emergency entrance. Through the window, Lucia could see the steady stream of activity, the promise of help so close now. Emily shook violently in her arms, a spasm that rocked her entire body. A weak groan slipped from her lips, the first sound in many minutes. "We're here, sweetheart," Lucia whispered, holding the girl tightly to her chest as though she could somehow give her own life to Emily. "We're here." David parked right at the entrance, ignoring the no parking signs. The engine died, and for a brief moment, everything was quiet. The emergency corridor seemed endless. Lucia followed behind the rolling gurney carrying Emily, who was unconscious. 2 nurses pushed it quickly while a doctor in a short lab coat walked alongside, checking the girl's vital signs. "Fever at 104.5, dropping blood pressure, rapid pulse," the doctor told the nurses. "We need to stabilize her now." Lucia tried to keep up, her heart pounding. They had arrived at the hospital mere minutes ago, after David had helped her from the car. Everything was happening at breakneck speed, as if time had sped up. Emily had worsened drastically during the drive. The red spots now covered her entire face, extending down her neck and chest. Her breathing was shallow and fast, as though each breath demanded an impossible effort. "What's wrong with her?" Lucia asked, running to stay next to the gurney. The doctor, a young woman with dark hair in a tight bun, shot her a quick look. "It appears to be a severe systemic infection, possibly sepsis or meningitis. We can't confirm without tests." Lucia felt her knees weaken. Meningitis. The word dropped like a sentence. A neighbor in Fairview had lost her child to meningitis the year before. The kid had gone to bed with a fever and never woke up. "Will she be okay?" The question came out almost inaudible. "We'll do everything we can," replied the doctor, keeping her focus on Emily. "But we have to act quickly." They turned right down a dimly lit hallway. A sign read, "Pediatric Emergency." The walls, previously sterile white, were now decorated with colorful paintings of animals and clouds, a stark contrast to the grim situation unfolding. A set of double doors slid open automatically, and the gurney rolled into a large room equipped with monitors and machines Lucia had never seen. 3 other professionals were already waiting there. "Mom, I need you to wait outside," said the doctor, as the nurses transferred Emily to a hospital bed. "But we'll take care of her, I promise. But we need space to work." Lucia caught one last glimpse of Emily being hooked up to tubes and monitors, looking even smaller and more fragile under the harsh white lights. Then she was gently ushered out of the room by a nurse. The nurse led her to a small adjacent waiting area. "Dr. Torres is the best we have," he said, trying to offer comfort. "She'll take good care of your daughter." Lucia just nodded, unable to speak. She collapsed into a plastic chair, staring at the door Emily had disappeared behind. 20 minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Lucia remained motionless, only her restless fingers drumming anxiously on her knee. The waiting area was almost empty at this time of night. An elderly man slept in a distant chair, and a woman flipped absent-mindedly through an old magazine. At last, Dr. Torres appeared. Her face was serious but not grim, a sign Lucia took as slightly positive. "How is she?" Lucia asked, standing up immediately. "We've stabilized her fever and started IV antibiotics," said the doctor, "but the situation is concerning. We need to run some tests to confirm the diagnosis and determine the proper treatment." "What tests?" "Blood work for a complete blood count, a lumbar puncture to analyze the cerebrospinal fluid, and a cranial CT scan to check for any neurological complications." Each word sounded like a hammer blow. Lucia tried to process everything, feeling small and ignorant next to these medical terms. How long will that take? Preliminary results should come in a few hours. Meanwhile, she'll stay under close observation, and we'll continue the antibiotics. Lucia nodded, running a trembling hand through her messy hair. "Can I see her?" "Soon. She's being prepped for the tests right now." Dr. Torres paused, consulting a clipboard. "But first, we need to handle some administrative matters. Did you check in at registration?" "No, we came straight to the emergency room." "I see. In that case, you'll need to stop by the front desk to fill out forms and present your insurance card." Lucia's stomach dropped. This was the moment she'd feared since they arrived. "I don't have insurance." The doctor's expression shifted subtly, not with disdain or irritation, but with a tired resignation, as though she'd seen this scenario countless times. "Understood. In that case, you'll have to speak with the administrative office about payment options. But they'll still treat her, right?" Anxiety made Lucia's voice climb an octave. "We'll stabilize her, of course. That's protocol. But for more complex procedures and inpatient care, we need to address the financial aspect first." Lucia felt the air leave her lungs. More complex meant exactly the tests the doctor had just mentioned. "Please," she whispered. "My daughter needs those tests. She couldn't finish the sentence. "We'll do what we can," Dr. Torres said, her professional tone softening. "Come with me to the front desk. Maybe we can find a solution." Lucia followed automatically, like a robot on autopilot. Her thoughts spun in frantic circles. No insurance, no credit card, only $10 in her pocket. Emily needed expensive tests and hospitalization. They walked down another corridor, passing rooms where other emergencies were unfolding behind partially drawn curtains. Groans, cries, voices calling out orders, a macabre symphony of a hospital at night. The reception area was a curved desk, under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. A middle-aged woman with graying hair typed at a computer. Her badge read, Margaret. Margaret, this is the mother from room 3, Dr. Torres said. She doesn't have insurance. Margaret looked over her reading glasses, sizing Lucia up quickly. I see. Her voice was neutral, almost mechanical. We'll need your documents, please, and we'll discuss payment options. I can't pay, Lucia said, finally stating the reality out loud. We offer installment plans, Margaret responded, as if Lucia hadn't understood. And in certain cases we have assistance programs, but we need to review your finances in detail for that. Lucia thought about her situation, unemployed for months, living off odd cleaning jobs, behind on rent, with a nearly empty fridge. What kind of financial review could she possibly pass? She's my daughter, Lucia said, her voice trembling. She's all I have in the world. Please? Margaret sighed, a sigh that carried years of similar conversations. Ma'am, I understand, but the hospital has protocols. She pushed a form across the desk. Please fill this out. Meanwhile, your daughter will continue to receive necessary stabilization. But what about the tests? And inpatient treatment? We'll have to evaluate that after we know more about your situation. Dr. Torres, who remained beside them, intervened. Margaret, the girl is in serious condition. We suspect meningitis or sepsis. We can't wait. Doctor, you know the rules, Margaret replied, lowering her voice. I can authorize life-saving emergency care, but extended hospital stays and additional tests need approval. Lucia stood there as though watching a foreign movie without subtitles. The words reached her ears, but their meaning was lost in a fog of fear and despair. Emily was dying while they debated bureaucracy. Please, Lucia broke in, tears now streaming openly. I'll do anything. I'll work here to pay it off. I'll clean floors, scrub bathrooms, whatever it takes. Just help my daughter. Margaret looked at her with an expression of pity and helplessness. Ma'am, They can go ahead with the treatment. I'll cover it. A low, firm male voice came from behind Lucia. She turned, surprised, to find David standing there. She hadn't seen him since they entered the hospital. She assumed he'd left after dropping them off. His expression was the same as before, contained, almost impassive. But there was something different in his eyes, a resolve that hadn't been there earlier. Sir? Margaret adjusted her glasses, confused by his intervention. I said I'll pay, David repeated, stepping up to the desk. All the tests, the hospital stay, the full treatment, whatever is necessary. Lucia stared at him, stunned. She barely knew this man. She'd gotten into his car less than an hour ago. Why would he do this? Are you a relative of the patient? Margaret asked, now more helpful. No, I'm a friend of the family, David answered without hesitation. He pulled out a wallet from his jacket and placed a black credit card on the desk. This card has no limit. Please order all necessary tests and treatments immediately. He turned to Dr. Torres. There's no reason to delay, Doctor. The doctor nodded, visibly relieved. I'll authorize the tests right now. As Dr. Torres hurried away, Margaret typed information into the computer with renewed efficiency. I'll need some of your details, sir, she said, again in a professional tone. David provided his name, address, and other details while Lucia stood there, a mix of relief and confusion swirling inside her. The knot in her stomach began to ease, replaced by gratitude so intense it almost hurt. Within 10 minutes, all the paperwork was signed. Margaret handed David a provisional receipt and a consent form. The girl will be admitted to the pediatric ward after her tests, she explained. The attending physician will talk to you both once the results are in. David only nodded and slipped the papers into his jacket pocket. As they walked away from the desk, Lucia finally found her voice. Why did you do that? David didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on some distant point down the corridor. Come, he said at last. Let's sit down. They walked together to the waiting room, now completely empty. The elderly man and the woman with the magazine had gone. Only the plastic chairs and a muted TV showing a cooking program remained. Lucia sat down, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the last few hours. David took a seat beside her, leaving some space between them. "You didn't have to do that," she said, staring at her hands. "It must cost a fortune." "Money isn't a problem for me," he replied simply. "But why? You don't even know us." David was silent for so long that Lucia thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, lower, more vulnerable. "I had a son." The use of the past tense did not go unnoticed. Lucia felt a chill run down her spine. "His name was Thomas. He was 6 when he got sick." David stared straight ahead as he spoke, as if seeing something beyond the hospital walls. It started with simple symptoms: fatigue, low fever, bruises that wouldn't heal. "I thought it was just a virus until—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Leukemia. An aggressive type. The kind that doesn't respond well to standard treatment." Lucia didn't say anything. What could she say? In the silence that settled, David's words echoed. "I spent 2 years in this same hospital. I knew every corridor, every waiting room. I learned more medical terms than I ever wanted to know." His fingers drummed slowly on his knee, an almost hypnotic rhythm. Thomas fought. God, how he fought. But in the end, David didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Lucia could see the rest of the story in his eyes, in his clenched hands, in the tension in his shoulders. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. David nodded, acknowledging her words without truly responding. "It's been 3 years. Sometimes it feels like it was yesterday. Other times, like a different life altogether." A heavy silence settled between them. The buzzing of fluorescent lights seemed louder now, almost intrusive in the intimacy of that moment. "When I saw you and Emily on the road," David hesitated, searching for the right words. "Something just clicked. It wasn't a conscious decision. I just couldn't drive by." A nurse passed through the waiting room, pushing a supply cart. The sound of the wheels on the vinyl floor briefly broke the silence. In the car, when I saw her symptoms, the spots, the way she was delirious, I remembered the nights in the hospital with Thomas. The helplessness, the fear. David paused. No child should go through that. No parent should have to choose between money and their child's life. Lucia felt tears well up in her eyes again. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he answered, finally looking at her. "I just want Emily to get better." It was the first time he'd said the girl's name. The simple fact that he remembered it felt like a gesture of unexpected kindness to Lucia. "You're not going to ask for anything in return." "You won't expect me to pay you back someday." David shook his head. "No, like I said, money isn't an issue for me. Still, it's a lot of generosity for a stranger." A sad smile appeared on David's face, the first real smile Lucia had seen from him. "Maybe I'm being selfish, actually. Maybe this is my way of coping with what happened to Thomas, of giving some meaning to all of it." Lucia understood that better than he realized. How many times had she searched for meaning in her own daily struggles, the challenges of raising Emily alone? How often had she wondered why life had to be so hard? In that moment, sitting next to this stranger who had just saved her daughter, Lucia felt a bond that went beyond words. A connection forged in shared suffering, in a mutual understanding of what it meant to love a child desperately. David looked at the clock on the wall. "The tests will take a few hours. You want some coffee?" It was a simple offer, almost mundane. But for Lucia, it represented something bigger, a safe harbor in the storm her life had become in the past hours. "Yes," she said, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Coffee would be nice." They stood up together and walked side by side down the corridor toward the hospital cafeteria. No more words were exchanged, but none were needed. The silence between them was different now, lighter, more comfortable. Doors that once seemed forever closed had been opened. Through them, a faint light began to shine. The clock on the wall showed 3:20 a.m. Lucia shifted in the uncomfortable chair beside Emily's bed, trying to find a position that wouldn't make her back ache. The hospital room was far too cold, the air conditioning droning incessantly. Emily slept now thanks to medication. Her pale face looked calmer, but the red spots still covered her skin, though they appeared less severe. A thin IV needle was in her arm, connected to a bag of fluids and antibiotics. 4 hours had passed since the doctors began running tests: a lumbar puncture, blood draws, a CT scan. Throughout each procedure, Emily cried quietly, begging to go home. Lucia tried to remain strong, but each tear her daughter shed felt like a knife in her chest. Now, at last, there was a diagnosis. More tests would come in the morning. Lucia looked at her sleeping daughter. She seemed so small in that hospital bed, surrounded by equipment and blinking lights that monitored her vital signs, so vulnerable. A gentle knock on the door made Lucia turn around. A middle-aged nurse with graying hair in a bun entered quietly. "How is she?" the nurse asked in a soft voice, checking the monitor beside the bed. "She finally fell asleep," Lucia answered. She was so scared. The nurse, Martha, according to her badge, nodded as she jotted something on a clipboard. "That's normal for her age. But children are stronger than we think." She checked the IV bag, adjusted the flow, and gave Lucia a warm smile. "Dr. Torres wants to speak with you. She's waiting in the hallway." Lucia felt a pang of anxiety. Conversations with doctors rarely brought good news, especially at 3 in the morning. "Can I leave her alone?" "Yes, I'll stay with her until you return." Lucia stood up, her legs numb from sitting in the same position for so long. She smoothed her wrinkled blouse and stepped into the hallway. Dr. Torres was there, speaking quietly with another physician, an older man with a white beard. As soon as she saw Lucia, the doctor approached. "Ms. Mendez, this is Dr. Richard, an infectious disease specialist. He'll be overseeing Emily's case from now on." The older doctor extended his hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I've reviewed your daughter's test results," he said. "We're fairly certain about the diagnosis now." Lucia's heart pounded. "Is it meningitis?" "No," Dr. Richard replied. "It's a severe bacterial infection, but not meningitis. Emily has what we call septicemia, a bloodstream infection that has spread throughout her body. It's serious, but we caught it relatively early. Will she be okay?" The only question that mattered. The two doctors exchanged quick glances. "It's a serious condition," Dr. Torres explained. "But we've initiated the right treatment, and she's young and otherwise healthy. That works in her favor. We're using broad-spectrum antibiotics while waiting for the culture results to identify the exact bacteria," added Dr. Richard. "But I need to be honest. She'll need to remain hospitalized for a significant period." "How long?" "At least 2 weeks. Possibly more, depending on how she responds to treatment." Lucia felt the floor vanish beneath her feet. 2 weeks. How would she pay rent, keep her new part-time cleaning job? How would they survive? "What if she doesn't respond well?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Richard kept his gaze steady but compassionate. "We'll face challenges as they arise. For now, the initial signs are encouraging. Her fever has dropped a bit, and her cardiac parameters are improving, subtle but positive indicators." Dr. Torres gently touched Lucia's arm. "I know this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know she's getting the best care possible." Lucia nodded mechanically. The words came to her as if through a dense fog. Severe infection. 2 weeks. Antibiotics. "There's one more thing," Dr. Richard said, checking his notes. "We'd like to run a few more tests in the morning to see if the infection affected any other organs." "Will it hurt?" Lucia asked, remembering how Emily had quietly cried during the lumbar puncture. "Very little. Some are just blood draws, others are imaging. We'll keep her comfortable." "And you," Dr. Torres added, "should try to rest. There's a reclining chair in her room. Not ideal, but better than a plastic chair." Lucia knew she wouldn't be able to sleep, not with Emily so ill. "Thank you, doctors," she managed. "Nurse Martha will be on duty all night. If you need anything, just call." The doctors walked away, their white coats disappearing at the end of the illuminated corridor. Lucia stayed where she was, unable to move. The information played on a loop in her mind. Septicemia, serious condition, 2 weeks. Her thoughts jumped to practical matters. Who would watch Emily after she was discharged? How would she pay the bills? And the apartment? She'd had only a month at her new cleaning job. Surely she'd be fired for missing so many days. The hospital's white walls seemed to close in around her. The smell of disinfectant filled her nostrils. And the fluorescent lights felt brighter, almost painful. Lucia leaned back against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor, her legs finally giving out. The tears came without warning. No longer the controlled tears she'd shed in front of Emily, but deep sobs that shook her entire body. Here, alone in the cold hospital corridor, she finally let the fear consume her. She had no sense of how long she sat there, curled up on the floor. It could have been minutes or hours. Time felt distorted in this place without windows, under lights that never went out. Eventually she sensed a presence. Someone had silently sat down beside her, without speaking or touching her, just there. Lucia lifted her tear-streaked face and found David sitting on the floor next to her, his back against the wall, looking straight ahead. He didn't look directly at her, giving her space to cry without embarrassment. "I thought you left," she said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. David didn't immediately answer. When he did, his voice was calm and quiet. "I went to get some things from my car." Only then did Lucia notice the plastic bag on the floor between them. David followed her gaze and nudged the bag gently toward her. "I thought you might need these." Lucia opened the bag curiously. Inside were a toothbrush still in its packaging, a small tube of toothpaste, a hairbrush, wet wipes, an oversized grey t-shirt, and a packaged sandwich from the hospital cafeteria. Simple, basic items, but at that moment, they felt like incredibly precious gifts. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling fresh tears form, different now, no longer despairing but grateful. David just nodded, still not looking directly at her. His profile was rigid in the harsh hospital light, his jaw set, eyes fixed on a distant point on the opposite wall. "The doctors say it's serious," Lucia spoke, needing to share the weight of that information. "A bloodstream infection. She has to stay for at least 2 weeks." David nodded again. He didn't offer hollow reassurances that everything would be fine. He just stayed there, present, listening. "I don't know how I'll handle this," Lucia continued. "My job, rent, everything." "One step at a time," David finally said. "For now, Emily needs you focused on her. The rest we can deal with later." "We can." The phrase lingered between them, laden with meaning. It wasn't an explicit promise, but it suggested he had no intention of disappearing. They sat in silence for a while. Around them, the hospital's rhythm continued unabated, hurried footsteps of nurses, occasional machine beeps, distant voices at the nurses' station. "When Thomas was sick," David said suddenly, still gazing ahead, "I spent 3 consecutive nights awake by his bedside. I thought if I closed my eyes, even for a minute, something bad would happen." Lucia listened without interrupting. "On the 4th night, a nurse brought me a cup of coffee and said something I never forgot." He paused. "She said, 'You can't take care of him if you don't take care of yourself first.'" David finally turned to look at her. His dark eyes reflected the fluorescent lights. "Eat something. Rest a bit. Even if it feels impossible. Emily will need you strong when she wakes up." Lucia knew he was right. As much as she hated the thought of eating or sleeping while her daughter was so ill, she took the sandwich from the bag and unwrapped it. "You should rest too," she said, taking a bite of the sandwich and realizing how hungry she was. "You don't have to stay here all night." "I'm fine," he replied simply. They ate in silence. Lucia her sandwich, David a granola bar he pulled from his pocket. The corridor was deserted now, except for an occasional nurse passing by, casting curious glances at the 2 adults sitting on the floor. "Why are you doing all this?" Lucia finally asked the question that had been circling in her mind since he offered to pay for Emily's treatment. David considered the question for a long moment before responding. "After Thomas died, I spent an entire year on autopilot. I worked, ate, slept. I existed, but I wasn't really living." He paused again. "Then one day, I read something in a book I found on his shelf. It was a children's book, but it had a line, something about how the only way to honor those we've lost is by living in a way that would make them proud." He looked at his own hands, as if searching for answers in the lines of his palms. Thomas would have stopped to help. He had that heart, that instinct to protect others. Even when he was so small. A fleeting, almost smile appeared on his face for a second. Maybe I'm trying to be more like him. The raw honesty of that confession left Lucia speechless. What could she say in the face of such pain and such a quest for redemption? I think he'd be proud, she finally said. David closed his eyes for a moment, the only sign that her words had affected him. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence, more comfortable, almost like a third presence between them. Two strangers, brought together by chance and pain, sitting on a hospital corridor floor. Martha, the nurse, appeared at Emily's room door. "She's waking up," the nurse said softly. "She's asking for her mom." Lucia stood quickly, tossing the sandwich wrapper into the bag. David remained seated, watching her go. Before she entered the room, she turned back. "Will you stay?" "For now," he answered. "Then I need to sort some things out, but I'll come back." Lucia nodded and walked into the room. Emily's eyes were half open, still heavy with medication. When she saw her mother, a small smile appeared on her pale face. "Mommy," she whispered. "I'm here, my love." Lucia took the girl's small hand in hers, careful not to disturb the IV needle. "How are you feeling?" "Tired and cold." Lucia adjusted the thin hospital blanket around Emily's shoulders. "I know, sweetheart, but it'll pass. The doctors are taking care of you." Emily looked around, confused by the strange environment, the machines, the blinking lights. "When can we go home?" "Not now, honey. You need to stay here for a while until you're better." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared, Mommy." Lucia's heart clenched. How many times had she tried to protect Emily from every fear, every pain? And here they were in a cold hospital, facing the biggest fear of all. "I know, my love. But you know what? You're the bravest girl I know." She forced a confident smile. "And I'll be here with you. The whole time. Promise?" "I promise." Emily seemed a bit calmer. Her heavy eyelids began to close again. "Is that man still here?" she asked drowsily. "Yes," Lucia answered, surprised that Emily remembered David. "He's in the hallway." "He looks sad," Emily murmured, almost asleep. "Like you do sometimes." The simple, innocent observation struck Lucia deeply. How could children see through the layers adults constructed? How could they sense hidden pain in others? "Get some sleep, sweetie," she whispered, kissing Emily's forehead. "I'll be here when you wake up." Emily drifted off almost immediately, her breathing more regular now. Lucia stayed by the bed, holding her hand, listening to the constant beep of the heart monitor, a sound that once seemed alarming but now was almost comforting. Each beep meant Emily's heart was still fighting. When she returned to the hallway hours later, David was gone. In his place, on the chair where he had been sitting, was a small brown teddy bear, simple and without tags or trimmings. Next to it lay a folded piece of paper. Lucia picked up the note and opened it. "Had to leave, but I'll be back later. My number's below if you need anything. I got yours from the nurse, I hope you don't mind. The bear is for Emily. David." Lucia pressed the bear to her chest for a moment, a simple, unassuming gift. Exactly like the man who left it. The hospital corridor was still cold, the fluorescent lights still buzzing, doctors and nurses rushing by, but something had changed. A presence lingered even in David's absence. Solid, respectful, almost familiar. Lucia returned to Emily's room, carrying the teddy bear. The long wait for her daughter's recovery would be hard, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. Night had already fallen when David parked the black sedan in front of the house. He turned off the engine but didn't move. He just sat there, staring through the windshield at the two-story home with a white wooden porch. The house looked exactly as he'd left it, almost untouched by time. The front lawn was neatly trimmed. He still paid for a gardening service regularly. The outdoor lights turned on automatically at dusk, giving the false impression someone lived there. But the windows were dark, with no sign of life. David took a deep breath and finally stepped out of the car. The cool night air hit his face as he walked the stone path to the front door. His keys jangled, louder than they should have in the stillness of the suburban neighborhood. The door opened with a slight creak. Inside, the air was stale, carrying that unmistakable smell of a place seldom inhabited, despite weekly cleanings. David didn't turn on the lights right away. He let the darkness swallow him for a moment, as if he needed that instant of transition between the outside world and the memories waiting inside. When he finally flipped the switch, the living room revealed itself to be meticulously organized. Dark leather sofas, a solid wooden coffee table, shelves lined with neatly arranged books. Everything was clean, orderly, and completely impersonal, like a luxury hotel room, almost impersonal. On the wall opposite the entrance hung a single photograph that broke the neutral decor. A simple silver frame held the image of a boy about 6 years old, smiling broadly. Dark hair ruffled by the wind, eyes bright with joy. Next to him stood a younger version of David, wearing a rare smile. Thomas. David walked slowly toward the photo but didn't touch it. He just stood there, looking at the son who was no longer present. The picture had been taken during a park outing, just weeks before the first symptom appeared, before everything changed. Without switching on any more lights, David headed for the kitchen. He opened the nearly empty fridge, just a few bottles of water and basic ingredients he rarely used. He closed it without taking anything and leaned against the counter, gazing at the space around him. Here in this same kitchen, Thomas had sat on a high stool for breakfast before school. Here he'd doodle while waiting for dinner to be ready. Here they had made plans for a future that never came. David climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. In the upstairs hallway, he passed his own bedroom without entering. He stopped at the next door, closed, as it had been for the past 3 years. His hand hesitated on the doorknob. For a long moment, he thought about turning back, returning to the car, driving away. But something kept him there, something to do with an 8-year-old girl fighting an infection in a cold hospital, and her mother sitting on the corridor floor, facing her fear alone. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. Thomas's room looked exactly as it had the day they'd left home for what became an emergency hospital stay. The bed was neatly made with a planets and stars comforter. The shelf held children's books and small swimming trophies. The desk still had colored pencils arranged by shade, a habit Thomas had developed during his long hospital stays. David entered slowly, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. He sat on the edge of the small bed, the mattress sinking under his weight. He ran his hand over the comforter, recalling countless nights he'd sat right there, reading bedtime stories about adventures, bravery, and heroes who overcame the impossible. Stories that, in the end, hadn't been enough to save his son. On the nightstand, a small plastic photo frame held a picture of the two of them at the beach. Next to it lay a children's book, a bookmark still stuck where they had left off. A book that was never finished. David picked it up, opening it to the marked page. It was a story about a boy who found an injured animal and helped it recover, a tale of compassion, of lending a hand to those in need. Thomas had loved the beginning, eager to see how it ended. The weight of memory fell upon David like an avalanche. He recalled endless nights in the hospital, watching his son sleep among medical equipment. He remembered the constant fear, the helplessness, the anger at a world that could make a child suffer so much. He remembered how he had faced it all alone. Thomas's mother had left when he was just 2, unable to handle family life, disappearing without a trace. Since then, it had been father and son against the world, and then, suddenly, just him. Alone with memories and a house far too empty, he placed the book back on the nightstand, exactly where it had been. 3 years had passed, and he still couldn't bring himself to finish reading that story. For a long time, David just sat there, looking around the silent room. The memories came in waves. Thomas laughing as David tossed him in the air, Thomas falling asleep in his lap during a movie, Thomas crying in pain during the harshest treatments, Thomas asking with childlike innocence if he was going to die. Then, amid those memories, another image formed in his mind. Emily, lying in a hospital bed, much like Thomas's. Emily with red spots on her pale face. Emily fighting an infection that threatened her young life. And Lucia sitting on the cold corridor floor, breaking under the weight of her fear and uncertainty, facing what he knew so well, all alone. Something wet touched his hand. David looked down, surprised to see tears running down his face, silently falling onto his fingers. He hadn't cried since Thomas's funeral. He'd built walls so high and thick around his grief that tears simply stopped coming. But now, sitting in his lost son's room, David wept, not only for Thomas, but for all the times he'd driven past someone in need, for all the times he'd refused to get involved, fearing that if he opened the door to compassion, the pain would return too. When he finally stood, the sky outside the window was showing the first hints of dawn. David wiped his face with his shirt sleeve and took one last look around Thomas's room. "I can't turn away this time," he whispered to the silence. "I can't just drive by." He descended the stairs with steps lighter than before. Something had shifted during that long and painful night. A decision had been made, not with his head, but with that part of his heart that still knew how to feel, despite everything. By the door, he paused again before the photograph in the living room. Thomas's smiling face no longer seemed only a painful reminder of what was lost, but also a reminder of what his son had taught him about love, courage, and compassion. "I'll try to be like you, son," he said quietly. "I'll try." He locked the door behind him. The morning sun was starting to light up the neighborhood's rooftops. David walked to the black sedan, breathing in the crisp morning air. He got in, started the engine, and adjusted the rearview mirror. The face that looked back at him seemed different. The same eyes, the same lines, but something had changed. A spark of something that had vanished 3 years ago was beginning, very faintly, to return. Without looking back, David pulled the car onto the road and headed toward the hospital. The steady hum of medical equipment provided a kind of background music in Emily's hospital room. Lucia sat in the uncomfortable armchair beside the bed, flipping aimlessly through an old magazine she found in the waiting area. She wasn't really reading. Her eyes scanned the pages while her mind stayed locked on her sleeping daughter. The night had been rough. Emily woke up several times, confused and frightened by the unfamiliar environment. Her fever was finally starting to subside, but the red spots still covered much of her body, though they looked fainter now. The hospital breakfast sat untouched on the tray, a dubious-looking porridge and green jello Emily refused to eat. Lucia checked the clock on the wall. It was almost 9 in the morning. She hadn't slept more than a few scattered minutes throughout the night. Her eyes burned from exhaustion, and her head throbbed faintly. A light knock at the half-open door made her turn. For a moment, she didn't recognize the man standing there. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him. Maybe it was the morning light, or perhaps something in his expression. David. He held 2 take-out coffee cups. Wordlessly, he entered the room and offered one to Lucia. She accepted it, her fingers briefly brushing his as she took the cup. The warmth of the coffee seeped through the cardboard, warming her cold hands. "Thank you," she said quietly, careful not to wake Emily. David nodded without replying. He looked at the girl in the bed, noting the equipment, the fading spots on her face, the IV line in her thin arm. Something in his gaze had changed. There was still pain, but not only pain. He pulled another chair over and sat down, keeping a respectful distance. Together, in silence, they drank the coffee, watching Emily sleep. No explanations or justifications were necessary. David had left, and now he was back. It was that simple. "She had a tough night," Lucia said after a while, her voice low. "But her fever's finally going down." "That's good," he answered, equally quietly. Another silence fell, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who shared an understanding beyond words. Morning light filtered through the blinds, creating shifting patterns on the hospital floor. Outside, the hospital launched into another day of frantic activity. But in that small room, time seemed to move at its own pace. David had returned, just as he promised. No grand announcement, no elaborate explanation, only hot coffee and his steady presence. For Lucia, that spoke louder than any words could. The night stretched on slowly in the hospital. Lucia dozed off briefly at times, then woke up in alarm to check on Emily. The fever had dropped significantly during the night, and the red spots appeared less prominent under the monitor's blue glow. David stayed in the room, seated in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the far corner. He didn't sleep. His eyes shifted between Emily and the window, which showed the first signs of sunrise. Occasionally, when he thought Lucia was asleep, his gaze lingered on her, on the exhaustion etched in her features, on the silent determination of her posture, even in slumber. Every 2 hours, a nurse came in to check Emily's vitals and change the IV fluid. On her third visit, she glanced at David curiously. "Sir, you really should try to rest," she whispered. "There's a lounge for family members down the hall with more comfortable chairs." David just shook his head. He didn't explain that he wasn't family. He didn't say that he preferred the uncomfortable plastic chair over possibly missing any change in Emily's condition. He simply nodded his thanks and continued his silent vigil. At 6 in the morning, Emily woke up. Her eyes, previously clouded by fever, now looked clearer. "Mommy?" she called, her small voice breaking the room's stillness. Lucia snapped awake instantly, as if she'd never really been asleep. "I'm here, baby. How do you feel?" "Better, but I'm thirsty." David rose quietly and went to the table where a pitcher of water stood. He poured a cup and handed it to Lucia, who helped Emily sip carefully. "Thank you," the girl said, turning her gaze to David. "Did you stay here all night?" He nodded, not elaborating. He didn't need to. "Why?" Emily asked, her childlike curiosity unfiltered by adult politeness. David hesitated briefly. "I just wanted to make sure you were both okay." That simple answer seemed to satisfy Emily, who gave him a faint smile before closing her eyes again. This time, it was not a feverish delirium, but natural drowsiness. Lucia looked at David, an unspoken question in her eyes. Why indeed had he stayed all night? What kind of stranger dedicates himself so fully to people he barely knows? David looked away, seemingly uncomfortable with the unspoken question. He walked to the window and cracked the blinds slightly, letting in a thin beam of morning light. "It's morning," he said unnecessarily. "I'll get us some coffee." Without waiting for a response, he left the room. In the hallway, he took a deep breath. He couldn't quite explain it to himself why he'd stayed. Or maybe he could but wasn't ready to admit it. The hospital cafeteria was almost empty at this hour. Only a few residents with dark circles under their eyes, looking exhausted, sipped strong coffee at distant tables. David ordered 2 coffees and some pastries, remembering Lucia probably hadn't eaten anything substantial in over a day. When he returned to the room, he found a different scene. Dr. Torres was there, examining Emily while Lucia looked on, visibly anxious. David paused in the doorway, hesitant to interrupt, but the doctor saw him and motioned him in. "Good morning, Doctor." Torres said, "We were just discussing Emily's progress." David entered and placed the coffees on the small table, maintaining a respectful distance. The doctor turned her attention back to Emily, checking the fading spots on her neck and arms. Her expression was serious but not worried. "The rash is receding significantly," Dr. Torres commented, making notes on her clipboard. "And the fever's completely under control. That's excellent news." She glanced at the heart monitor by the bed. "Vitals are normalizing. Very good." Lucia held Emily's hand, their fingers tightly interwoven, as though that physical contact were an anchor for both of them. "What does this mean, Doctor?" Lucia asked, hope and fear in her voice. "Doctor." Torres smiled, a genuine smile, the first they'd seen from her since Emily's admission. "It means Emily is responding extremely well to treatment," she replied. "The antibiotics are working better than we expected. The infection is clearly on the retreat." Lucia brought her free hand to her mouth, stifling a sob of relief. "She's going to be okay." The question that had haunted her since they arrived at the hospital. "All signs point to yes," the doctor answered. "Septicemia is serious, but Emily has 2 major advantages. She's young and otherwise healthy, and treatment started fairly early." Dr. Torres paused, glancing briefly at David. "Getting her here when you did was crucial." Emily smiled, obviously understanding these were good news, even if she didn't fully grasp the medical jargon. "When can I go home?" she asked, her voice still weak but tinged with hope that hadn't been there the day before. "Not so fast, young lady," Dr. Torres replied kindly. "We still need to keep you here for a few more days. You need a complete course of IV antibiotics, and we want to monitor your recovery closely." She turned to Lucia. "If all continues to go well, she might be released in 5 or 6 days, but full recovery will take a few weeks, and she'll need follow-up appointments." Lucia nodded, letting every word sink in. 5 or 6 days, weeks of recovery, appointments. Relief over Emily's improvement mingled with worries about finances and logistics. "We'll reduce the frequency of routine checks since she's stable," Dr. Torres continued, "and we can gradually decrease some medications. We might even allow a broader diet if she feels up to it." Emily perked up at the mention of food. "I'm hungry," she announced, as if to prove her progress. The doctor smiled again. "That's wonderful. I'll order a proper breakfast. And both of you," she added, eyeing Lucia and David critically, "should eat something decent too. You both look exhausted." With a few more instructions and a promise to return in the early afternoon, Dr. Torres left the room. The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken emotions: relief, gratitude, exhaustion. "She's going to be okay," Lucia whispered, as though saying it out loud might break the spell. "My Emily's going to be okay." David stood still, watching the scene as though afraid to intrude on a deeply personal moment. But something in his posture changed. His constant tension seemed to lift, and his breathing was easier, as if an invisible weight had been partially removed. Suddenly, Lucia got up and, without warning, hugged David. It was an impulsive gesture, born of relief and gratitude, but also something deeper and indefinable that had been growing between them. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "Without you—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They both knew what might have happened if David had not stopped his car that day, if he hadn't brought Emily to the hospital, if he hadn't intervened when the hospital hesitated to treat her. For a moment, David froze, surprised by the unexpected contact. He had spent so long avoiding closeness, building walls around his grief, that the simple act of being embraced felt strange, almost threatening. Then, slowly, as if relearning a language long forgotten, his arms came around Lucia. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, but for David it felt like a small eternity, a moment out of time, away from the constant pain he'd carried for 3 years. When they pulled apart, both looked slightly embarrassed. Lucia nervously tucked her hair behind her ear, while David stared at some indistinct point on the wall. Emily watched with open curiosity, the frankness of a child. A small smile formed on her lips, as though she understood something the adults hadn't fully grasped yet. "The coffee's getting cold," David said at last, pointing to the cups on the table. Lucia nodded, grateful for the change of subject. "Yes, let's drink." As they sipped their coffee in a silence that was no longer uncomfortable, but instead full of new meaning, Emily asked to sit up. David adjusted the bed to a semi-reclining position, and Lucia rearranged the pillows for better support. "Mum," Emily said, sounding more awake and energetic, "can I draw?" The question caught Lucia off guard. It was such a normal, everyday request, like something Emily would ask at home on a regular day. Not what she expected to hear in a hospital room with her child, still hooked to tubes and monitors. "Draw?" "Yes, I'm tired of just lying here. I want to do something." Lucia glanced around, unsure. She hadn't brought anything for Emily. No clothes, no toys, no art supplies. The hospital stay had been too sudden, too desperate for such considerations. "I didn't bring paper or pencils, sweetie," she apologized, feeling suddenly inadequate. "Maybe tomorrow I can bring some from home." "I can find something," David interrupted, already heading for the door. "I'll be right back." Before Lucia could respond, he was gone. She stared at the closed door, unsure what to think of this man who kept surprising her with small acts of generosity. "He's nice," Emily commented, shifting to get more comfortable. "Why is he helping us so much, Mommy?" Lucia looked at her daughter, not sure how to answer, how to explain something she herself didn't fully understand. Some people are just like that, honey. They help because it's the right thing to do. Even to her own ears, it sounded incomplete. There was more to this story, much more. But how could she put into words what was happening between them? How to explain the bond forming, born of chance, necessity, and perhaps something deeper that had no name yet? David returned about 20 minutes later, carrying a paper bag. From it, he pulled out a simple sketch pad, a small box of colored pencils, and a few graphite pencils. They didn't have much in the hospital gift shop, he explained, handing the items to Emily. I hope this works. Emily's eyes lit up. Thank you. With surprising energy, she opened the sketch pad and started drawing immediately. Her movements were still slow, and she paused occasionally to rest, but the concentration on her face was the same as always. Lucia watched, amazed by her daughter's resilience. Just yesterday, Emily was delirious with fever, covered in red spots. Today she was immersed in drawing as though the hospital was just another place where her imagination could flourish. What are you drawing? Lucia asked, moving closer to the bed. The three of us, Emily replied simply, continuing to outline colorful shapes on the page. The three of us. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lucia glanced at David, who had moved toward the window, giving them some privacy. Emily drew for nearly an hour, occasionally asking for a different pencil or showing them her progress. She started with a picture of all three of them. Simple stick figures, with Lucia and Emily holding hands, David standing beside them. Then she drew the hospital with large windows and smiling doctors. Finally, she began sketching what looked like a park, with trees, a lake, and a big yellow sun smiling in the sky. The hospital breakfast tray arrived, a bowl of oatmeal, a small sandwich, and some jello. Emily set her drawing aside to eat, surprising Lucia with her appetite. She finished nearly all of it, something she hadn't done since before her illness. Looks like someone's really feeling better, Lucia said, relieved to see her daughter eating well. Much better, Emily agreed. It hardly hurts at all now. David had come closer again, observing the scene with an expression that was hard to read. There was something in his eyes, a mix of relief, nostalgia, and maybe a twinge of sorrow, as though seeing Emily improve brought both joy and pain. David, Emily said, looking up from her tray, do you want to see my drawings? He approached, taking the pages Emily handed him. This is us, she explained, pointing to the first drawing. And this is the hospital. And the other one is a park where we can go one day. David studied each sketch carefully, as if they were masterpieces. His fingertips traced the stick figure that represented him, standing next to Lucia and Emily, part of the little family Emily had created in her imagination. They're very nice, he finally said, his voice huskier than usual. Oh, you have a real talent, Emily beamed, pleased with the compliment. I can draw more. I want to draw your house too. My house? Yeah, what's it like? Does it have a yard, a pool? Her childish curiosity was boundless. David hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with personal questions. Lucia was about to step in when he answered, It has a yard. Smaller, but there's a yard and no pool. Do you have trees? A slight smile appeared on David's lips. An old apple tree. I love apples, Emily exclaimed excitedly. We can draw that. What else? Is it big? Does it have stairs? David continued answering, growing more at ease with Emily's innocent interrogation. Little by little, through her questions and his short replies, his house took shape on the page, a two-story home with a porch, an apple tree in the yard, and a small chimney with a curly plume of smoke. Lucia watched, fascinated by the subtle transformation in David. Each of Emily's questions, each small detail he revealed about his life, seemed to dissolve a layer of his guardedness. His face, usually so closed off, occasionally softened. His eyes, always alert but distant, focused intently on Emily's latest sketch. The morning passed in this way, Emily drawing, asking questions, sometimes resting when she got tired. David responding, observing, helping when needed. Lucia alternated between active participation and simply watching the two of them interact, amazed by how naturally it developed. The hospital room, once so cold and impersonal, was gradually transformed. Emily's drawings were taped to the walls, adding color to the sterile surfaces. The teddy bear David had left took pride of place beside Emily on the bed. The side table accumulated little treasures, colored pencils, folded napkins Lucia had taught Emily to make, a cup holding daisies a nurse had brought. Slowly, that space ceased to be just a hospital room. It became a place of hushed laughter, whispered stories, colorful drawings, a place where hope grew with each passing hour as Emily improved. Around 11 in the morning, Dr. Torres returned for another evaluation. She smiled at the drawings on the walls. "Looks like we have an artist here," she said, examining one of Emily's creations. "And it seems like she has plenty of energy." She examined Emily again, checking the rash, her temperature, her vitals. Her expression was visibly pleased. "Impressive," she finally declared. "The improvement is much faster than we expected. The rash is fading, her temperature is normal, and her vital signs are stable." She looked at Lucia and David. "You've got a little fighter here." "When can I go home?" Emily asked again, clearly excited by the doctor's praise. "Not yet, young lady. We need to finish your course of antibiotics to make sure the infection is entirely gone." Dr. Torres adjusted the IV flow. "But if you keep improving at this rate, maybe 3 or 4 days instead of the 5 I initially estimated." After the doctor left, Emily resumed her drawing, now working on something she kept hidden from Lucia and David. "It's a surprise," she declared when Lucia tried to peek. "I'll only show you when it's done." Lunch arrived. A soup, a small sandwich, and some gelatin. Emily ate it all, chatting between bites. Every minute that passed, she seemed more like her usual self, curious, talkative, full of energy. It was mid-afternoon, while Lucia was adjusting the pillows, that Emily finally unveiled her secret drawing. It was a simple scene, 3 figures holding hands beneath a big yellow sun. But there was one detail Lucia noticed right away. All 3 figures were smiling, with giant grins occupying most of their stick figure faces. "This is for you," Emily said, extending the drawing toward David, "to say thank you." David accepted the paper carefully, as if it were extremely fragile and precious. "Thank me for what?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Emily looked at him with a wisdom that sometimes appears unexpectedly in children. "You brought my smile back," she said simply, pointing to the figure representing herself in the drawing. "You helped us when we were alone, and now I'm not sick anymore." "And look," she added, pointing to the stick figure representing David, "you're smiling too in the drawing." The silence that followed was profound. David stared at the drawing, his fingers tracing the outlines of the smiles Emily had so carefully drawn. Then something happened, something small and almost imperceptible, yet tremendously significant. Slowly, as if he'd forgotten how the corners of David's mouth lifted, a smile, genuine, warm, transformative, spread across his face, lighting it completely. It was the first time he had smiled like that since Thomas's death, not a polite or automatic smile, but one that came from deep within, filled with relief and lightness. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice choked with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Actually, I think you're the one who brought my smile back." Lucia, who had been watching from the bathroom door after fetching a clean towel, felt tears well up in her eyes again. There was a painful beauty to that moment, in Emily's innocence, David's newfound vulnerability, and the unmistakable bond now uniting all of them. "Mummy, look," Emily called, noticing her mother. "David's smiling for real now." Lucia approached, discreetly wiping her tears. "I see," she replied softly. "It's a nice smile." David lowered his head, clearly embarrassed, but the smile remained. His face looked different with it, younger, lighter, as if years of pain had briefly lifted. The rest of the afternoon passed in a calm neither had experienced in days. Emily alternated between drawing and taking short naps. Lucia reorganized the small space, making it cozier with their limited resources. David left occasionally to get coffee or other needed items, but always returned quickly, as though worried he might miss something important. At one point, while Emily napped and David stepped out to make a work call, Lucia sat by the window, watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and pink. a simple beauty that felt more meaningful after days of fear and uncertainty. When David returned, he brought a small vase of fresh daisies and a sandwich for Lucia. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, offering her the food. Lucia accepted it, suddenly aware she had barely eaten all day. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for the sandwich. For everything." David sat in the chair beside her, also gazing at the sunset. For a moment they were silent, sharing the view and the peace it brought. "You know," Lucia finally said, "when Emily and I left home that day, I was desperate. I had no idea what to do or where to go. I just knew I had to save my daughter." She paused, fighting back the emotion. "Then you stopped. Out of all the people who passed by, you stopped." David didn't reply at once. When he did, his voice was low, reflective. "Maybe I needed to stop as much as you needed someone to." He didn't elaborate, and Lucia didn't ask. There was a truth in those words that needed no further explanation. The hospital room, now decorated with Emily's drawings and filled with the last golden rays of sunset, was no longer cold and sterile. It had become a space of healing, not just for Emily, but for all of them. David watched the final ray of sunlight disappear on the horizon, his face serene in the growing twilight. For the first time in years, he felt something other than the constant weight of loss. It wasn't exactly happiness. It was too soon for that. It was more like purpose, a sense of being exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. He had answered Lucia and Emily's plea for help on instinct, almost automatically. But now, sitting in that hospital room transformed by their presence, he realized that in some mysterious way, they were also answering a call he hadn't known he was making. A sense of peace was taking root, not just around them, but within him. A peace he had forgotten existed. And with that peace, for the first time in a long while, came a glimpse of hope. Morning light shone through the hospital windows, brighter and more welcoming than it had seemed on previous days. Emily sat at the edge of the bed wearing a simple dress Lucia had brought from home. The red spots had almost completely disappeared, leaving only a few faint marks that Dr. Torres said would fade soon. Her legs swung back and forth eagerly as she watched her mum fold their few clothes and gather up the drawings that had decorated the hospital walls. 6 days had passed since her admission, days that felt both fleeting and infinite. "Do we have everything?" Lucia asked, carefully placing the last drawing into a manila folder the nurse had given her. Emily nodded, hugging the little teddy bear to her chest. David's gift hadn't left her side the entire stay. "I can't wait to sleep in my own bed," Emily said, her face glowing with excitement at going home. Lucia smiled, feeling the weight of the past days in her bones. Emily's swift recovery had been almost miraculous, according to Dr. Torres. The infection that could have been fatal had responded to treatment with surprising speed. On the 5th day, they'd removed her IV. On the 6th, the doctor had finally cleared her for discharge. "The ambulance should be here in half an hour," Lucia said, sitting beside her daughter on the bed. They didn't have a car, and the money for a taxi would be better spent buying the medication Emily would still need at home. "Can't we wait for David?" Emily asked, glancing at the door as if expecting him at any moment. Lucia hesitated. "He said he would come if he could, honey. But he had a work meeting this morning, remember?" David had been at the hospital every single day of Emily's stay, arriving in the mornings with coffee for Lucia, spending hours listening to the girl's stories, helping her with drawings. Sometimes he stayed late into the night, sitting in silence while Emily slept and Lucia tried to rest in the uncomfortable recliner. The previous day, he'd mentioned an important meeting at his company. He promised to try to make it afterward, but no guarantees. Lucia understood. He'd already done more than any stranger would. In fact, more than most friends or family would. "We still have to stop by the pharmacy before going home," Lucia reminded her, hoping to distract Emily. "Then we can buy ice cream to celebrate." Emily smiled, but a bit of her excitement was gone at the possibility of not seeing David before leaving. A nurse entered, carrying a clipboard with some forms. "All set for discharge," she said brightly. "Just need your signatures, and you're free to go." Lucia took the pen and started signing where indicated. Full name, date, address. Formalities marking the end of a journey that had almost ended in tragedy, now concluding happily. Done, Lucia said, handing back the clipboard. Everything okay? All in order, the nurse replied. I'll just process these, and while I do, you can finish packing, Dr. Torres will do a final checkup before you leave. No sooner had the nurse left than rushed footsteps sounded in the hallway. Emily looked up, eyes wide with hope. The door swung open and David stepped in, slightly out of breath, as though he'd been running. He wore a well-cut dark suit, likely straight from his important meeting. I was afraid I wouldn't make it in time, he said, stepping into the room. He looked at Emily, already dressed and ready to go, and a genuine smile lit up his face. So today's the big day. David, Emily exclaimed, her face breaking into a radiant grin. You came. Of course I did. I promised, didn't I? Lucia observed them with a lump in her throat. It was remarkable how, in such a short time, David had become such a significant presence in their lives. Not only for what he'd done, paying for treatment, spending hours at the hospital, bringing little gifts and comforts, but for how he'd done it, quietly, without seeking praise, simply being there. I brought something for the ride home, David said, pulling a small, brightly wrapped package from his pocket. Emily accepted the gift with shining eyes, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a thin book of short stories. Something for you to read on the way, he explained. Or for your mom to read to you. They're short animal tales. I thought you'd like them. I love it, Emily exclaimed, flipping through the illustrated pages. Thank you, David. Lucia met his gaze over Emily's head. Thank you for coming, she said softly. It means a lot to her. And to me, he replied simply. Dr. Torres entered at that moment, cutting the exchange short. She gave Emily one last exam, reviewed the instructions about medication and care, and finally announced, You are officially discharged, young lady. But I want to see you at my office next week for a follow-up. Understood? Emily nodded solemnly. I promise. The doctor smiled, then turned to Lucia. The nurse said you arranged for an ambulance. Yes, it should arrive soon. David cleared his throat. Actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to drive you home. My car is out front. Lucia hesitated. The offer was tempting, certainly more comfortable than an ambulance. But they already owed him so much. As if reading her thoughts, David added, Please, I'd like to see this through. There was something in his eyes, an almost tangible need to complete what he'd started on that day they met on the roadside. Lucia realized that, for him, it wasn't just about helping. It was about being part of something that was helping him as much as it was helping them. All right, she finally said. Thank you for the ride. Emily couldn't hide a little jump of excitement on the bed. We have to cancel the ambulance, Lucia remembered. Already handled, Dr. Torres said with a knowing smile. Mr. Bennett mentioned he might offer you transportation. Mr. Bennett? It felt strange hearing David's last name. A reminder of how little they actually knew about him, despite the intensity of the bond they'd formed in a few short days. Within minutes, they were ready. A nurse brought a wheelchair, standard discharge procedure, and Emily sat in it with a regal dignity, clutching both her teddy bear and her new book. Lucia carried their small bag of clothes and artwork. As they moved down the corridor, they had walked so many times under such different circumstances, Emily looked up at David, who walked beside her wheelchair. Will I see you again? She asked in her small but direct voice, free of any adult need to hide vulnerability. David paused, looking first at Emily, then at Lucia. A silent question passed through his gaze, and Lucia answered with a slight nod. Yes, you will, he said firmly. It wasn't an empty promise or a platitude for a child. It was a calm certainty, the certainty of someone who'd found something he hadn't been looking for, but now refused to lose. They passed through the automatic doors into the bright morning. The black sedan was parked near the entrance, the same car that had stopped that fateful day when all seemed lost. David opened the back door, helping Emily climb in. Lucia sat beside her, while he placed the small bag in the trunk. Once he got behind the wheel and started the engine, his eyes met Lucia's in the rearview mirror. There was something different about them now, a light that hadn't been there before, a newly found peace. "Home?" he asked. "Home," Lucia confirmed. The car pulled away from the hospital, leaving behind days of fear and uncertainty. The ride back wasn't lonely. The silence in the car wasn't heavy like it had been that first day. It was comfortable, full of unspoken possibilities. Emily was already flipping through her new book, pointing out the illustrations to her mother. David drove calmly, occasionally checking on them in the rear view. A light, natural smile replaced the rigid, controlled expression he'd worn the day they met. Lucia gazed out the window, watching the city pass by. The life they knew before the fever, before that roadside encounter, seemed distant now. A door had opened, not just the hospital door they had walked through, but a metaphorical door leading to a new and unexplored path. As the black sedan navigated the streets, Lucia allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was the start of something new, unplanned, unexpected, but profoundly right. The door was open, and together, they were walking through it. The phone rang in the small apartment in the Fairview district. Lucia answered, balancing it between her shoulder and ear while she helped Emily with her homework. "Hello? Lucia, it's David. I have good news." 3 days later, she sat in the elegant reception of a downtown office building. She wore a borrowed blazer, the only pair of closed-toe shoes she owned, and held a neatly printed resume on good quality paper. It was her interview for an administrative assistant position at the company where David worked. "I don't have office experience," she had protested when he suggested the opening. "You're organized, a quick learner, and you pay attention to detail," David said with the calm certainty she was getting used to. "Just talk to them." No commitment. Emily, listening from their worn-out couch, cheered the idea. "Go for it, Mum. You always wanted a better job." The interview went surprisingly well. The HR manager, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, asked about adaptability and problem-solving rather than degrees or past office work. "Technical skills can be taught," she explained. "Integrity and determination can't." A week later, Lucia was hired. The salary was nearly double what she used to earn, and the position came with health insurance that covered Emily. The first days were intimidating. New computer programs, corporate jargon that felt like a foreign language, a dress code that challenged her limited wardrobe, but she adapted quickly. Her efficiency and kindness won over co-workers and supervisors alike. With financial stability, the possibility of moving came into view. 3 months after starting the new job, Lucia and Emily left their apartment in Fairview. The house they rented was modest: 2 small bedrooms, a compact living room, a simple kitchen, and a tiny yard, but it was a world of difference. Located in a quiet neighborhood with better schools and safer streets, it felt like a dream come true. The move happened on a sunny Saturday. David brought a borrowed pickup truck and 2 colleagues to help. There wasn't much to transport, just a few simple pieces of furniture, but every item carried stories and memories. That evening, after everything was mostly unpacked and the helpers had gone, Lucia and David sat on the small front porch. Emily had fallen asleep almost instantly, worn out from the busy day. "I'll never be able to thank you enough," Lucia said, looking up at the starry sky. David stared straight ahead, his profile lit by the glow from inside the house. "There's nothing to thank," he replied. "Seeing you two like this, that's more than enough." The following months brought a steady, hopeful routine. Lucia thrived at work, taking on more responsibilities. Emily fit right into her new school, excelling especially in art class. Their little house gained personality: colorful curtains, potted plants on the windowsills, Emily's drawings on the walls. David remained present in their lives, but never intrusively. He visited regularly, often bringing practical gifts, potted herbs, books for Emily, basic tools. Patiently, they built a friendship with a strong foundation. It was during one of these visits, about 6 months after Emily's hospitalization, that Lucia noticed something different about David: an energy in his movements, a different sparkle in his eyes. "Did something happen?" she asked, when Emily ran off to fetch her newest drawing. David hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "I've been talking to the hospital's administration," he began. About a project I've been planning. What kind of project? An initiative to help families like yours, people who need urgent medical treatment but don't have the resources. His voice grew more confident as he spoke. A fund to cover costs, but also practical assistance, transportation, help understanding medications, support during hospital stays. He paused, visibly moved. We're calling it the Care Network, in memory of Thomas. Lucia felt tears blur her vision. It was the perfect project for David, turning his loss into something that would help others. That's wonderful, she said, knowing any other words would be insufficient. In the weeks that followed, David threw himself into the project with quiet intensity. He met with hospital administrators, gained support from local business owners, and structured the assistance fund. The Care Network took shape quickly. Central to the project was the principle that no family should face the despair of being unable to afford life-saving treatment. No one should feel what Lucia felt in that cold corridor when life-saving treatment for Emily nearly slipped away. The official launch took place at a small ceremony in the hospital. David, uncomfortable with public attention, gave a short speech. He didn't mention Thomas by name, but as he finished, he touched a small star-shaped pin on his lapel, a symbol his son had loved to draw on everything. Lucia and Emily were there, seated in the front row. When the ceremony ended, Emily ran up to David and hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you," she said, with a child's pure sincerity. The Care Network grew steadily. Within a year, it had already helped dozens of families. David balanced his time between his regular work and this new mission, finding profound fulfillment in it. One cold Sunday morning, almost a year after Emily's hospitalization, David arrived unannounced with fresh bread and coffee. "I thought you might like a different kind of breakfast today," he said, still somewhat shy despite months of friendship. Emily, wrapped in a fuzzy robe, opened the door and immediately peeked into the bag. "Cinnamon rolls," she exclaimed, thrilled, "my favorite." Soon the kitchen was filled with the aroma of fresh coffee. They sat at the table, talking about everyday things, school projects, news from Lucia's job, stories of families the Care Network had recently helped. There was an easy familiarity between them now. Lulls in the conversation weren't awkward, just quiet moments among people who didn't need constant chatter. After breakfast, despite the chilly weather, Emily insisted on showing David the small garden she was cultivating in the backyard. "The seeds are sprouting already," she announced, pulling him by the hand to see the row of pots lined against the fence. David listened with genuine interest as Emily chatted about her little plants, asking questions and offering suggestions as though her tiny garden was as important as his hospital project. At one point, Emily dashed off to the other side of the yard, eager to show him something she'd discovered. David stayed where he was, watching her. Lucia approached, standing beside him. "She's so happy," she said softly. "You both are," he replied, eyes still on Emily. "What about you?" Lucia's question came out as a whisper. David turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the clear winter morning light. "I'm at peace," he said simply. And it was true. Peace hadn't arrived suddenly, but gradually. The pain of losing Thomas still existed. It always would. But now it lived alongside something else: purpose, connection, a renewed sense of hope. Emily dashed back, cheeks flushed from the cold, her breath forming little clouds in the chilly air. "Come see! There's an old nest in the neighbor's tree." They followed her to the back fence. Emily pointed excitedly at a tangle of twigs high in the branches. "In spring, the birds will come back," she declared with childlike certainty. "Maybe they'll build nests in our tree, too." "In spring," David repeated quietly, his words carrying weight beyond a simple comment about birds. Lucia understood the deeper meaning. For so long after Thomas's death, David probably couldn't look to the future. Each day was just another to endure. Now he spoke of spring naturally. He planned, hoped, looked ahead. Emily ran around the small yard, arms spread like wings, making wide circles. Her laughter filled the cold air, creating a bubble of joy that seemed to warm everything around her. The little lemon tree in the corner, one David had brought months earlier, was showing its first tiny green buds, promises of future fruit. Around it, small sprouts emerged from the dark soil, tiny points of life defying winter. "You know," David said, watching Emily, "when I stopped my car that day, I never imagined I'd find encore this." His vague gesture seemed to encompass not just the yard, but everything that had happened since that roadside encounter. "You saved her life," Lucia replied. David shook his head slightly. "You saved mine too." The grief hadn't disappeared. Thomas's absence would always be part of him, but that pain, once paralyzing, had transformed into compassion for others, into action to ease their suffering, into meaningful connections. Through the care network and his bond with Lucia and Emily, David had found a way to honor his son's memory, not by clinging to the past, but by using it as a foundation to build something new and valuable. Emily kept running around the yard, her face lit with the joy of the moment. David watched her with a serene expression, finally finding a balance between what he had lost and what he had gained, a balance sustained by purpose. In that small yard, on a cold morning, new life was taking root, and with it, a promise that, no matter how dark the past had been, hope could still bloom. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.